Okay, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our fall speaker series of the Program in Criminal Justice Policy and Management at Harvard Kennedy School's Malcolm Wiener Center for Social Policy, which is on the topic of criminal law as a tool of authoritarian control. My name is Katie Naples-Mitchell. I'm the program director, and we'll be moderating this afternoon's conversation. Thank you so much to everyone who is joining us. Before we get going in earnest and I introduce our wonderful panelists and the rich conversation we're going to have this afternoon, I want to remind folks about the structure of these conversations and how you can get engaged in the conversation and share your ideas and resources and questions. So this is a moderated conversation. We'll start with just the two speakers, but if you have questions that come up as you are watching and listening, please feel free to either use the Q&A function or put them directly in the chat. At the end of that conversation, we'll leave at least 20 minutes for questions from the audience. And at that point, I'll go back through the queue of questions in the order in which they came in and invite you to unmute and ask your question directly of our panelists. If you have resources to share or research that's relevant, please feel encouraged to share it in the chat, and we will put all of those links up on our website with the recording from this event. Once that's processed, it takes us a couple of weeks usually to process those videos. We like to be ADA compliant, and we check the captions to make sure they're accurate and legible. Our events so far, the videos are being edited but are not posted yet. But again, they will be posted on our website, on the individual event pages from the entire series, as well as on our YouTube channel. And I'll drop those links in the chat momentarily. I think that's all the housekeeping I have. Our next session is not next week, but 2 weeks from today. It is October 29th with Stuart Schrader on police power and building authoritarian and social control, looking both at histories of militarization in policing in the US and also police power through police unions and other formations and how they shape political forces in the US. So you can learn more about that on our website. And thank you all so much for being here. I'd like to now pivot to introducing our wonderful panelists for the day, Rebecca Gordon and Michelle Brown. Thank you to both of you for being here with us. I'm going to give abbreviated versions of their bios, but you can read their full bios on our website. Rebecca received her BA from Reed College and her PhD in ethics and social theory from the Graduate Theological Union. She teaches philosophy at the University of San Francisco and for the Leo T. McCarthy Center for Public Service and for the Common Good. She has published a number of scholarly works, including her latest book, American Nuremberg, the U.S. Officials Who Should Stand Trial for Post-9/11 War Crimes. Welcome to Rebecca. And then Michelle Brown is a professor of sociology at the University of Tennessee and co-director of the Appalachian Justice Research Center. She is a criminologist and socio-legal scholar with a joint PhD in criminal justice and American studies. Her research and teaching areas include abolition and emergent forms of justice, carceral studies, law and society, and she's also an expert on media criticism and in particular crime media. We're really delighted to have both of you join us. Thank you so much for being here. So to kick us off in this conversation, I feel like the topic for our talk today, I guess I should also say, is the exporting and importing, militarization, policing, and imprisonment across borders. And I think it might be helpful to start at the conceptual level. So you have both written extensively about, in particular, the Bush administration's war on terror. And I want to explore specifically today about how presidential power and human rights norms shifted under that administration, but in a way providing a foundation for the kinds of enforcement decisions we're seeing unfold and deployments currently being made under the Trump administration. But before we get there, I'm hoping we can talk more about the language and the logic of war, right? And how that enables criminalization on a different scope or scale, especially in the US, right? We typically understand war is happening across borders, not domestically, but we also know that leaders do talk about a war on crime and a war on drugs. And what does the public lose? How are norms and rights eroded by accepting the idea that civilian law enforcement is at war with members of our communities? And also, how does the language of war communicate something new or different about the targets of state violence or law enforcement? So, Michelle, can we start with you? I know that's a big framing, and you can jump in wherever you feel motivated to answer.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you all so much for organizing and doing this kind of work around these issues, and thanks for having me here. I always kind of shudder when I'm referred to in any form as an expert, so I will just kind of get that out there. But I am happy to be in conversation with all of you today about these things. And for me at least, when I think about war conceptually in the context that I think we're talking about today, I just think about it not abstractly as foundationally bound up with what it is to be the United States. So in that sense, I think I really think about the logic of war as foundational to the history of colonization and conquest and what it is to be a settler, carceral state as I see it, and how that convergence takes shape over time. So we are in structures of war that are bound up with native elimination as well as chattel slavery and those histories moving forward. So I just wanted to maybe start there as the foundational setup, especially for talking about borders and the way we've conceptualized migration in the United States. Most of my work, though, historically has really gone back to this particular moment in time where, like you said, these phrases like war on drugs or war on crime or war on poverty or war on terror, like these wars are bound up with a particular kind of political moment in the 1970s and 60s when we see a reactionary law and order movement to what was essentially the civil rights movement, right? These basic efforts. So we're always kind of caught in the framework of insurgency and counterinsurgency, and that is ongoing, as is the logic of war. And I just would point, I think, to, how a lot of the work that I look to and the work that comes out of that moment talks about the rise of mass incarceration in the carceral state, not out of a particular kind of um, direct will of the people, but out of a particular kind of political formation that was bound up with a commitment to war and also an infrastructure of feeling that was being built and carries on. I use that term to really think about a feeling of safety as opposed to what safety actually means for communities and people who are caught, especially in mass incarceration. So a lot going on there, but I think that we really are living through the ongoing era of all of these things. So it is kind of an endless war in that sense. And that war just, it basically is always constructing an enemy. It's always relying on a very powerful way or set of logics and technologies to criminalize and to break apart communities, especially those communities who are the target of the state, as we've seen. So that's probably where I would start.
Very helpful framing. Rebecca, go ahead and jump in. I see you enthusiastically nodding, and
Oh,
that's
well,
terrific.
Michelle has said a lot of things that I agree with, especially placing some of the origins of this rhetoric of war back in the 60s and 70s. And, everything, whether it was cancer or drugs or poverty, became the target of a war. And when you do that, you create enemies. And when you create enemies, you create opportunities for dehumanization. I'm thinking particularly because I grew up in Washington, D.C. During the War on Poverty, that in that context, as women demanded in the welfare rights organization, African American women rose to demand access to those same welfare payments that had been available to white women since the New Deal, we began to see the war on poverty become a war on Black women's bodies. And we see the rise of things like the man in the house rule, which said that a woman could not receive benefits to support her children if there was a male human being living in her house. And that was enforced in DC, where I grew up, with actual nighttime raids on women's homes, as an example. But my particular sort of, it's not expertise, but my area of study in the last 20 odd years has been torture. So, and the deployment of torture, especially in the historically, and then again in the context of the so-called war on terror and the ways that um, what that consensus that that was something the United States didn't do. Of course, we were doing it in our prisons and in many communities, but the consensus was that we didn't do it. And what happened is, as we had a war on terror, we began to have enemies, and this circular rhetorical logic develops, which justifies the use of torture. And it goes like this: if we, as a good government, a democratic and just government, are forced by the terrible things that have been done to us to do these terrible acts, think how awful the people must be that we're doing them to, right? And it's a way of torture creates enemies. And just in the same way that war, torture is a subset of the kinds of physical trauma that we can, enact on each other. But torture creates enemies. And this is what the war on terror did as well. And during that context, we see people, and we see it again now in the time of the Trump administration, the rhetoric surrounding the people who become the targets of these wars are they're referred to not as human beings, but as vermin. In Chile, under Pinochet, they were called humanoid to explain the difference between them and human beings. Our Vice President, J.D. Vance, contributed a foreword to a book called Unhumans, which is about the dangerous communist left. And again, we see this framing of the people who are the targets of the war as not human. Um, the other thing I want to say is that when we use war as a metaphor, that metaphor ends up killing actual people. And we see this, for example, with the war on drugs, when we look at the violence inside Mexico, which has killed over 80,000 people and who knows how many disappeared, all of it with drugs, I'm sorry, with arms that are imported from the United States across that border, and drugs that come back the other way, where we are, in fact, the consuming nation that created that war in the first place. And I know we're going to talk about this later, but of course, we now have a new escalation of the war on drugs, in which the United States has announced that we are in a war against specifically Tren de Aragua and um, various other cartels in Venezuela. And we see the result of this is the murder of, now it's up to the destruction of 5 boats and up to 27 individuals who, as far as we know, were fishermen. And in fact, J.D. Vance thought it was very clever and funny to say, well, if I were you, I wouldn't go fishing in the Caribbean. So I've got a lot more to say, but as I
Yeah,
warned you, I
we can
tend to run
pause
on.
there. No, that is all extremely helpful, right? I appreciate you both, Michelle, bringing us starting from sort of the language and legacy of conquest and chattel slavery that are foundational pillars of kind of U.S. imperialism, and also thinking then about what that looked like, how that evolved over the 20th century, both domestically in the language of war, and then into the 21st century in increasing use of different kinds of tactics of torture in the war on so-called war on terror. And Rebecca, I really appreciate that. I think maybe counterintuitive notion that torture creates enemies, and it's not just vice versa, right? That having both in terms of practicality, right, in terms of people who experience torture, actually having animosity that is derived from trauma, but also in terms of the naming of and dehumanization. I think those insights are really important for grounding this conversation. So thank you for starting at that level of the conceptual. And so from here now we get more concrete. And you both have written, and already we're talking about the war on terror, right? And exploring these tactics, dehumanization, concentration of federal power under the executive branch, right? So I thought if we could start with sort of a more in-depth history lesson, Rebecca, about kind of the primary elements of the Bush administration's agenda that you have researched and that you think laid a foundation for the kinds of authoritarian creep we're now seeing. And in particular, how this informs how communities or leaders who are opposed to this concentration of power can respond based on tactics that were tried and or failed under prior administrations.
Okay, it's a big order, but what I'd like to do is sort of divide the Bush-Cheney strategy into 3 separate categories: the rhetorical, the legal, and the military. And before I say any of that, I want to say that shortly after the attacks of 9/11, Cofer Black, who was working with the CIA, goes up to Capitol Hill and explains that there was a before September 11th and an after September 11th, and after September 11th, the gloves come off. And of course, the reality is that that's not actually true at all. September 11th is actually a piece of continuity with a long history of US colonial and neo-colonial expansion and military adventurism. But that break, or defining that break, allowed the Bush-Cheney administration to implement publicly some things that they might have done covertly under other circumstances. So rhetorically, what we have is this circular logic that I was talking about before, but we also have the expansion of the idea of a war that begins as an attempt, as a military response to what really was a crime, and at the international level, those terrible attacks on September 11th. But the expansion of the enemy far beyond Osama bin Laden or the members of Al Qaeda who were directly responsible for those attacks, to Donald Rumsfeld, who was then Secretary of Defense, said there would be 60 countries at least where we would have to operate militarily, because at first we were conducting a war on terrorism, which is a tactic, right, of struggle of one sort or another, and then it became a war on an emotion, terror, and that is an infinitely expandable rhetorical device, because you can make anybody, as we've seen with Donald Trump today, talking about creating this new category of domestic terrorist organizations and applying that to something that isn't an organization at all, this thing he calls Antifa. So, so that's sort of the rhetorical. And then we see the same kind of logic, this circular logic, actually in the ICE detentions today. The logic is, if someone is detained, they're not a citizen, and therefore they don't have the rights that would accrue to them to challenge their detention. And it's the same kind of logic. If we got you, you must have deserved it. And therefore it can continue. So the legal changes are, I think, in some ways the most important, because this is what has laid the groundwork for the Trump administration's complete rejection of the rule of law in so many different realms. But so it begins with, under Bush Cheney, the rejection of international law. Okay, so one of the first concrete actions is early on. The CIA developed their torture program in Afghanistan as early as, late 2001, beginning of 2002. And the Washington Post was already reporting on it. You could know about these things if you wanted to. But early on, what they decided was that if we continued the process of participating in the International Criminal Court, which is the court where individuals can be tried for war crimes if they can't successfully be tried in their own countries, we decided, that is, Donald Rumsfeld wrote to the ICC and said that although the compact had been signed by the US, it had never been ratified by the Senate, and that we were withdrawing our signature. Congress went on to pass a bill which would make it illegal to assist the ICC in trying any US person. We called it the Invade the Hague Act, because they said that they would actually use military force to rescue anyone who was actually transported to The Hague to stand trial. But that was just sort of the beginning. We also see the rejection of the Geneva Conventions. John Yoo in his memos writes about them as quaint, right? And no longer relevant in this new kind of war, which is, on the face of it, absurd. A, it's not a war, and B, it's not new. But that was the excuse used to essentially say we are no longer bound by rules, the international rules of law, international humanitarian law, which is the overall expression, which means the law of how nations behave during wartime, both in terms of how they treat civilians and how they treat soldiers as well. We also see the invention of non-existent legal categories, the unlawful combatant, and using that category as an excuse not to give people rights that under treaties that we have signed, that we are parts of, should be in fact enforceable. They are under the supremacy clause of the Constitution. They are part of US law. We see something similar, as I was saying before, in the creation of this new domestic terror organization designation, which has no legal ground, no legal basis at all. And so we're seeing how these legal maneuvers that began with Bush and Cheney in the international arena now come home and are being deployed inside our own country. And then just briefly, I'll talk on about the military. I mentioned that really our response as a military response, and especially the invasion of Iraq, which had nothing to do with September 11th, but whose involvement was used as an excuse for the torture program. So the beginnings, the first few years of the torture program, the entire purpose, as was articulated to the targets of torture, was to get somebody somewhere to say that Saddam Hussein had been responsible for September 11th because of a long-standing, going back to the 1990s, desire of neoconservative wing of the government to invade Iraq and to, enact regime change. Something, by the way, we're about to see in Venezuela, according to the Times today. So yeah, that was made possible by a law called the Authorization for the Use of Military Force, which was passed in Congress in those terrible, frightening days right after September 11th, along with the U.S. Patriot Act, which allowed all kinds of constraint on U.S. citizens. The use of military force what became the umbrella permission for not only the war in Afghanistan, which was enough of a problem, the illegal invasion of Iraq, the wars in Syria, but also any number of other military adventures around the world. Successive Congresses have attempted to repeal the AMUS, Authorization for Military Use of Force.
Yeah,
right?
AUMF, that's right.
AUMF, right. They've tried to repeal it and nobody's been successful. It's still in force today. And it is likely that if, as seems to be the case, Trump decides he actually wants to see some kind of regime change affected militarily in Venezuela, that it will become the legal underpinning for that. We're going to talk about this more, but the other effect that we see is the militarization during the War on Terror of U.S. police forces here at home. And that includes both the deployment of leftover materiel, military grade MRAPs and tanks and, automatic weaponry to domestic police forces. But we also see this revolving door between people who have been involved in urban combat in Iraq and Afghanistan now coming back into the US police forces and being involved, bringing that mentality and that training into the work of civilian policing. And so lessons learned. It's really hard to claw back rights and liberties that have been taken away. It is most of them are things that people fought and died for in the first place, right? None of them, were given to anybody. They were fought for and they were struggled for. But once they are gone, it is very hard to claw them back. So that's one thing. The second thing we learned, and I say this as a member of the movement that opposed these wars during the War on Terror, we live in a time when communications and the way we communicate change so rapidly. So in 2022, along with a group of people, we established something called Wartime's Tiempo de Guerras, which was a tabloid newspaper, bilingual, that we distributed to 700 organizations for free around the country. And it was a placeholder for where a peace movement would be eventually, but didn't exist yet. And in the 2 years that we published the physical paper, the internet changed so dramatically
I just want
that
to be clear, Rebecca, you said 2022, but I think you meant
I meant
'02, right?
2002.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes, sorry,
Just so we're
sorry.
placing this in time and
Yes,
helping people think
2002.
about the
Yes,
internet. Yeah,
my apologies.
absolutely.
Yes,
No, no,
thank
no,
you so
that's fine.
much. Yes, so the way the internet worked changed so much that stories that we had published in a paper in 2002 were brand new to the people who were reading them in a physical paper. By 2004, there was very little that we could put out in the terms of actual news that people didn't already have access to somewhere else. And I think this is something that's relevant to us today as we think about how people in this country learn about what is happening here and in the world. Um, the other thing I'll say is that our resistance is going to be local as well as national, and it's going to depend on huge numbers of organizations. And I'll just sort of end this piece with something about the hyperlocal. I have a dear friend, a Latino woman who lives in the Pilsner neighborhood in Chicago, which is a Latino district. And I texted her today because we're staying in touch. And she wrote back and said, yeah, talking about ICE in Chicago. Yes, it's surreal. But I'm heartened by the coordination across neighborhoods and rapid response groups. I attended a training last week that was great. Her son Joaquim, who's a college-age kid, is now organizing a similar training at our parish. We are also meeting regularly as a family, so this is really hyper local, in order to make sure the family stays safe. All are networked across neighborhoods. It's beautiful. And then she says the Latino suburbs are a different story. They're fighting back, but the repression seems even more brutal. All out on October 18th, which, as you know, is No King's Day.
For that. That I think gives us a lot to work with in terms of understanding the legal landscape, understanding the rhetorical landscape, thinking about the capture also of media and the use of mis or disinformation in selling a political agenda, right? Also the way that you talked about the Bush administration kind of capitalizing on the real felt unsafety in the in the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, right? And the way that that enabled these two massive unbridled pieces of legislation that continue to have tentacles in the life that we're living now. So I really appreciate you laying out that landscape. And, Michelle, to kind of pick up the baton from Rebecca, you've written in particular a lot about Abu Ghraib and the relationship between sort of governance and militarization and punishment, right? And thinking about, we've been having these conversations over the course of the semester so far, thinking about the popularity of punishment and how that enables kind of authoritarian creep. But I wonder if we could speak a little bit about how the Bush administration encouraged the US population to accept violence against, so-called criminal others, right? And as a necessary price of safety, and thinking about what lessons we can draw from this in our current moment.
Yeah, so you kind of invited me and forced me to revisit my work, I think, around Abu Ghraib. It had been a minute, although the themes are continuous in terms of the way punishment and the carceral state is developed. So, I think I would say a couple of things. One, it is, this focus on the Bush administration for me is really important, but also, I think about the law as a socio-legal scholar as a space where the state of exception is always present and always available, ready to materialize given certain conditions, including the kind we're living with right now. So, I think that was another moment in which it played out with all the important specificity that Rebecca just laid out. So for me, though, I think when I decided to write or really focus on Abu Ghraib, I was doing field work as a graduate student in prisons in various parts of the US. And Abu Ghraib struck me. I I was able to resonate with this quote by Michael Taussig, which is about the normality of the abnormal is shown for what it is. So terror as usual. And that was very consistent with what I was seeing. So why write about Abu Ghraib? Because the supermax wings and prisons that I was working in were the spaces where they pulled leadership to go to Guantanamo, to build Guantanamo and Abu Ghraib. So there was already this domestic practice that was being, built into these kinds of international or undefinable scape black sites, right? So I was also fascinated with kind of the legal theories of defense at the time around Abu Ghraib, which was either on the side of the state, there was a few bad apples, right? It was the bad apples theory, or, in terms of defense, they were following orders, none of which address the actual conditions for what happened. So he's very much interested in the structural way mass incarceration in the carceral state and the boom around prisons was building out this possibility for this space. And I think I've just kind of followed that, how the carceral state merges so easy with militarization. And that has only moved forward. We can talk about it later into spaces like Cop City and different spaces. I saw just now, I think somebody posted the Alabama solution in the chat. And a lot of the images in that film that are reported out from folks who are incarcerated are not that different from what we saw at Abu Ghraib. There's a lot there to say, but I would also say that I was really interested in the fact that this was building structurally on the kinds of spaces that working spaces at home. So a lot of the folks, the few individuals who were involved in this act, they were coming out of prison towns. They were coming out of, there was this merge of class and prisons and labor, low level work. Rural prisons built in mining communities where I live, which is one of the most densely packed regions of prisons on top now of mountains where they were mining, where nothing else can exist. So really thinking about the military industrial complex merging, in this prison town kind of a life. And then on top of that, carrying forward into the moment, there was a lesson that, you could link this concept of safety, as we've talked about, to suffering, to the suffering and torture of other people, criminalized and racialized others, and that their humiliation, their torture, and their deaths were totally acceptable. Again, you will see this in the Alabama solution. I'm going to cite the film a couple times. I have problems with the film, but not with the folks who are reporting those images out. So this is consistent with, I think, what we were seeing in, the criminology spaces and the spaces of what we would call the criminal legal system, where there was this merge that Rebecca talked about very nicely with increasing kind of the militarization of all agencies associated with the carceral state. So I think that's what I would say about that. I would also say, though, that the reread of that was brutal for me, going back to that article, because, I wrote it a while ago and, we haven't made a material dent in this yet.
Right.
Yeah, I'm sorry to force you to revisit it, but I'm greatly appreciative that you did, because I think part of the theme of our series, right, is to think about how these themes are recurrent in time, in space, across countries, across borders. What are borders, right? And sort of drawing together these sort of shared narratives. So I appreciate that reflection too, of like how much has yet to change, and also how much that's an existing foundation that then becomes a springboard, right?
May I add a couple of
Yes,
things?
absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
About Abu Ghraib. So I've taught courses on ethics and of war, torture, and terrorism, and in that context, I will show a slideshow of some of the images that were captured by the National Guardsmen at Abu Ghraib and were eventually shared up the chain of command and finally broke the story open. And the last time I showed those, a student interrupted me in the middle and said, "Wait a minute, why are you showing us these pictures?" And I said, "Because I think it's important for you to understand what torture, and that this is actually mild compared to things that we know have been done in other places, but what it looks like." And the student interrupted me and said, "No, you don't understand. we've all seen so much worse than this. This isn't shocking to us. And I think that that is also a change that has happened in the time since September 11th, that and the time since the beginning of the war on terrors, that we have become inured. And Michelle's pointed to something else that I think is very important, which is that essentially the government made a pact with the good citizens of the United States, which was, let us do these terrible things over here on the dark side. And in return, we promise that you will always be safe. And of course, that promise was a lie. It's impossible. Essentially, it was a promise of immortality that could not be complied with, couldn't be kept. But at the same time, it allowed people in this country to accept as the price of their own security that terrible things should happen to other people. And that's clearly the case when we think about how communities think about the carceral state and about incarceration. There is a willingness, and it's spoken about directly in terms of security and safety on the streets, right? I live in San Francisco. I've got a billionaire here, Mr. Benioff, who is begging the president to send the military into San Francisco to keep us safe. And I think this is the false agreement that especially white comfortable people are asked to make with the state in return for an illusory safety.
Yeah. There's so many places we could go, and I'm also mindful of time. But I do think one of the themes that has come up from both of you is about this existing relationship of kind of militarism within law enforcement, right? Michelle talking about the prison nation and the prison industrial complex locally, and the building of prison towns, and then the hiring of people who have actually participated in war zones in law enforcement, the giving of old decommissioned law enforcement, military equipment to law enforcement, right? There's a special grant program in the federal code that enables that. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about those connections and what kinds of guardrails might be needed to prevent law enforcement from one, kind of moving into that more militarized setting. We're seeing now, even in jurisdictions that formally do not work with ICE, for example, that there are still, these people are coming to their attention regardless through the regular process of booking and having their fingerprints entered into a national fingerprinting database, right? So what could be done to create a more separation in this, or is this problem too entrenched to even begin that process?
Yeah, I think at least we have to understand this as a shift in labor and occupational culture in the United States. Because when we talk about a guard culture and what we have built out of this kind of moment in terms of mass incarceration and various kinds of war approaches, like this is a thing that we can map. We know that about 1 out of 5 employees in US are involved in some sort of guard labor. We know that 80% of what is done in criminal justice systems is policing. We know that this expands around particular kinds of contexts. I'm really concerned about how work, even more broadly, increasingly has to look with the gaze of an army, right? So there's kind of this internal way in which this culture develops from our schools forward. So one of the things that I like to think about in terms of this, Nicole Siegel has a book on violence work and talks about the rise of the violence worker, and that there's kind of a new designation. And I imagine like Stuart Schrader next week will be talking more about these things, right? But like the centrality of men and boys, and increasingly women and other folks, to an expansive web of security and gendered performances that constitute their reproduction. This is something Deb Cowan writes about in when she talks about surplus masculinities in relationship to these kinds of things. So people whose authority depends on the threat or potential for violence, right? And that these are crossing all sorts of boundaries. and that this is, again, something that we see not only as permissible, but desirable. Now, I want to be clear here because I think Rachel Hertzing was on the call here a minute ago, and Rachel's work is amazing. And Rachel has said, and then, talked about, part of what we've seen in this moment of movements and in the aftermath of the George Floyd summer is a fracturing of ideological consciousness around policing. That in fact, people are very much not up with police in lots of ways. So there are lots of ways in which communities and various actors are trying, would prefer to have other means to think about safety, if we can even unco-opt the term, because it has been so deeply taken from us. But I think that in addition to that, right, we really have to ask what policing is in this moment and how militarization works with it. And how we can fight it. It is one of the things that's most resistant to spaces of change and transformation, and at a moment is kind of grasping for this expansion in this crisis of credibility that we've had. So guardrails, I mean, I'm not super, I'm more about let's really dig in deep and understand what we're up against. I was talking with some folks, other organizers on another call from Project South, and the hardest thing to fight or to organize around in the Cop City fight was police. You could talk about land and you could talk about labor and you could talk about water, health, but when you got to police, it's really hard to move the barometer here in ways that matter. And I think that we're really going to have to think about how defund approached a particular kind of center of gravity in US politics, and then how the backlash was framed to really come back at it. And to the extent that now here we are under the Trump administration where our cities are being patrolled by the National Guard, which I no longer know how to separate these things myself conceptually. I would say, though, coming back to Rebecca's point, like there is something to the way in which violence interruption, alternative crisis response, this hyper-local rapid response networking around community points to, if not a guardrail, a space where we can continue to build collectively around the commitments that matter to us. And as you can see, people will gravitate to those spaces. Angelinos will show up and figure out a way to obstruct people from being taken from their communities. And I think that's the grounding point right now. I work with lawyers all day, and I believe in the movement lawyer deeply. And I'm also very critical of litigating the revolution, that we will in fact have to find a way into community spaces and social movement work, and continue to do that work. It's there. I think that we've been through a lot and a lot of people are exhausted, but I still think it's there. But the litigation part and trusting the law and the rule of law, I'm one of those folks who's a lot less committed to those things, although rights are incredibly important. It's just rights can also be taken, and it's the police who take them.
I really appreciate that comment. And I think you're totally appropriate and right to reject my framing when it's not, and that's great. You're right. I really appreciate that. I think the point about like, we can't tinker around the edges of something that's sort of rotten to its core, if that's part of what the metaphor thinking about, there's an oft-used metaphor in the realm of policing about like rotten apples, right? And I think the point is that the rot spreads, right? It's this institutional systemic set of problems. And so I really appreciate that framing. I think I'm going to move us along just in the interest of time. This event does go until 5:45, but I want to make sure we have plenty of time for questions. So there are two more things I wanted to definitely talk about. One is something we've alluded to already today, which is how the actions of U.S. military abroad can be imported into U.S. context, right? We've been talking about that. But I think now we're also seeing sort of a feedback loop of that, right? Which now we're seeing the administration multiple occasions now targeting, as Rebecca mentioned in some of your earliest comments this evening, making allegations that people are involved in drug trafficking or cartels and engaging in extralegal executions in open waters, and having there be no due process whatsoever in an act that is nominally related to the drug war, a domestic vision of war being used for actual acts of war in international waters, right? So I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about this this feedback loop, which is sort of a new development we're seeing, and what we should make of the president's specific invocation of seeing US cities as, quote, training grounds, right? A direct quote for future wars. Rebecca, can you lead us off, and then we'll come back to Michelle. When you're muted, my friend.
Yes, when I unmute, yes. To begin with, yes, it's true that Trump has talked about these cities as training grounds, but in reality, it is the military adventures over the last, the whole post-World War II period in which were the training grounds for what is now coming back into our cities. And the difference is that we're going to see the direct deployment of people who are still in national federal military uniform in our cities, as opposed to that kind of recycling that we were talking about before between police forces and the military. But the training ground is really dual. But it has been over the last 30, 50 years. It has been in other countries. And, thinking about also that cycle that has created some of the problems that we are now seeing, again, it has to do with what, especially US policy in Latin America has been over, the well, since going back to 1927, when the US overthrew the presidency of Nicaragua and forward. And so, one very specific example of that, which leads into this war on drugs, is that during the time that the US was supporting the authoritarian regimes of Duarte and then other people, Cristiani and so forth, in El Salvador, during that time period, many refugees came from El Salvador to the United States and settled here, especially in, in a number of places, but along the West Coast in Los Angeles and in San Francisco. And when I was back in El Salvador in 1993, doing some electoral training with members of the FMLN, which is another whole story, I saw on the walls of houses in San Salvador the tags from my neighborhood in San Francisco, because the drug gangs that grew up in El Salvador during that time of war and in the time since then grew up during the war in the United States. And then when the war ended and people went back to El Salvador, they took back with them this drug gang structure, which grew into the Salvadoran pandillas, the Salvadoran drug structure, including Trump's favorite target, MS-13. That was a Los Angeles gang that went back to El Salvador. So there's a very real sense in which US military and destabilization in Latin America has led to the kind of crisis that we're seeing of migration today, and including the violence that attends that crisis and that attends even the effort of moving from one of the countries in that triangle up to the United States. So I'll say that. I also want to point out, here's another recycling. We're now using Guantanamo as a site to hold detained immigrants, right? Not huge numbers, but there have been something like 600 or 700 who have been shipped through there. And there's no reason logically. There's plenty of detention space, and they're building it out all the time in the US, and it's going to be such a, boondoggle for the private prison companies. But there's a rhetorical and sort of optical reason for using Guantanamo, because it ties people who've been deported from this country back to the worst of the worst, the people who attacked us on September 11th, which of course is not who was actually held in Guantanamo anyway. But so this is, I think, another example of how we're still recycling imagery and meaning from that time into the present time, and it still holds power for those who lived through the war on terror.
Go ahead,
Can I add
Michelle.
one thing?
Yes, add.
No, I mean, the only thing I would add to that is, at least for me, and the way this really hits is around the notion of cop city and the way in which cop cities are building up across the US and in most cities in some form. And to think of them, right, that these are spaces uh, really where they are designed in practice to be counterinsurgent spaces, right? So they always include a mock city for urban warfare scenarios. They're built around training grounds in that way. They're convergence points for multiple levels of law enforcement and military. And there's the goal has been increased surveillance and protest suppression. And they're built around, interesting in Atlanta, right? It was built around the mayor's offering of it to because of the low morale of the police forces, right? So they're built up again with that affective experience of identity, and the way that that works. But I think it's really important to understand that recruitment, retention, the way in which cop cities are igniting this as training grounds. A lot of you have probably seen this, but there's a film by Sierra Pettengill, Riotsville, USA, which connects these to the trainings that were happening by police and military in the 1960s to suppress protests and movements, and then kind of is a parable for where we are. Really thoughtful. So just wanted to add that.
I appreciate that. I'm cognizant of time, and though we do have more questions prepared and more topics I wish we could definitely talk to, I also want to make sure we open up space for audience members. So for folks who have already put questions in the chat, I really appreciate that. And if you have questions that are burning, please feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A. But we're going to start by inviting a couple of people to unmute. And then if we run out of audience questions, we can come back to the ones that I've prepared. But in the meantime, our first questioner is Xavier de Hanon. I'm going to allow you to talk, and you can unmute and ask your question directly if you'd like.
Hi, what a privilege. Thank you for sharing all these connections. Yeah, I work at the National Lawyers Guild, and I resonate very strongly with the law not being our only tool for liberation. It might be the last tool, honestly. But something that we've been reflecting on is how the Trump administration has basically used ICE as its boots on the ground, right? This is the soldiers that he has full authority over. And I've been interested in how the Tren de Aragua, like imagination of an international terrorist organization, is being used to go against immigrants and anyone around them. We saw raids in Chicago that were supposedly looking for Venezuelan gang members, but they ended up raiding an entire apartment complex. And so I am wondering if y'all could reflect on what's similar and what's different from the Bush war on terror, right? Where FBI was raiding mosques and was, going around looking for the enemy within. Yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Michelle, do you want to go first? Okay.
Clearly a Rebecca question.
Okay, well, I think there are differences. For one thing, I think there are vastly more targets today in the United States than there were targets within the United States for the Bush administration. One of the key methods that they used, in addition to the kinds of raids on mosques and that sort of thing, was entrapment and the use of the FBI to cultivate people as informants, and those poor people in Lackawanna near Buffalo who were enticed into doing something they never actually did anything, but they were entrapped into doing something and ended up spending decades in prison. And this was a common technique. This isn't what they're doing now. What they're doing now is the deployment of full terror. And when you talk about Tren de Aragua, it's they started as a prison gang in Venezuela. They're not even that big a deal in Venezuela, but they've become symbolic. And in the case of the attack on the apartment building in Chicago, they initially said that there was a whole nest of them, right? Then they said, well, actually, were only two, and now, as of yesterday, there was one who was possibly in some way connected to Tren de Aragua. But it's just like the use of MS-13. It's naming something. And I saw earlier, by the way, in the chat, the suggestion that actually Antifa does fit the definition of a domestic terrorist organization. And I would push back against that a little bit on the grounds that it's not an organization, that that it once again, it doesn't have nearly the strength and power and reach. I mean, that it is being used to represent in the context of an attack on the people in this country. So I think that what we're seeing today, the thing you said, Javier, that really makes sense to me is that I would say that ICE is essentially going to become, and especially with the addition of 10,000 new people and the reduction of the whatever the criteria are for, hiring them, that's really Trump's paramilitary. There's a paramilitary right now in Nicaragua, and some of the immigrants that I spend time with have talked about leaving the country because they were being forcibly recruited into it. But this is Trump's paramilitary, and it really exists for him, and even more than him for Stephen Miller, who is really the person who is pulling those levers to exert military control over and above the policing control that already exists. I think one of our wedge areas is going to turn out to be conflicts where they happen between local legal structures, including sometimes maybe even the police, and those federal forces, that we're going to see them in conflict with each other. And while we may not support either one of them, we might be able to take advantage of that conflict in some way. Can I just say thank you for the work you do with the National Lawyers Guild? The biggest problem that immigrants face here, in addition to everything that the administration is doing and the structural, strategic incompetence of the immigration system, is that there are not any lawyers. And the immigration judges use the fact that someone doesn't have a lawyer as proof that they're not taking the situation and the process seriously. I've seen this spoken over and over again. So thank you, Javier, for your work.
Thank you both. Next up, we have a question/comment, but there is a question there from Kathy Raboul. Kathy, I'm gonna unmute and allow you to talk so that you can unmute yourself, I should say, and ask your question directly.
Thank you. Yes. So I think that for me, I've been following an author, Steve Hassan, that talks about the cult of Trump, and he talks about the sense of belonging. And I'm very interested. There was research a while back that said if you think your group does something wrong, you sort of excuse it away. And if you see another group do something wrong, you sort of notice their mistakes. It was a really great research, but I won't go into all of it. But I'm struck when you have police, correctional officers, and Trump voters, and even us on the other side, we don't question. It's such a belonging and identity. How do we sort of break through that? How do we talk to people they just believe it? I have someone an acquaintance, I would say now, who just absolutely believes that Trump is going to the cities and saving us from rapists and murderers. So when belonging and identity are a factor, how do you get through that? Thank you for listening to my question.
Thanks, Kathy. Go ahead, Michelle.
It's a really, really, really important question, and I don't have a great answer for it. I think it's something that I actually think about a lot, though. In my own work, I'm a criminologist. My teaching involves working with students who aspire to exactly that kind of life and profession. And many are coming in because they have a certain belief that we've engendered around what safety or what protection looks like. And so, aside from education, and I think our education should be not just, I think that a part of why I do this work at the center that I'm working at is because I believe we have to, get rid of the boundaries between kind of access to education, that we need political education and we need popular education around these sorts of things that invite people into another sense of belonging, right? And one that's really meaningful around the work of safety and accountability and the kinds of practices that we know work and aspire to and build relationships and communities as opposed to tear them apart. And so I've really tried to dig into like what is this psychic attraction, right, to a life committed to that kind of violence or degradation, and how is the valorism of militarization, of being military or being police, kind of this notion of sacrifice and heroism that are built into that. And I think we really have to work around this notion of the heroic being a place where it actually disappears important work. It's not collective work. It's individualized work. It's a particular kind of notoriety and one that's really dangerous in the forms that it takes. But in terms of my media and cultural work, I really do try and think about that question and what even in the line of like occupational work we could attract students to that would shift some of that. It's a question for all of us. I really appreciate it.
I have some experience working with Unite Here, the Hotel and Restaurant Workers Union, on 4 electoral campaigns in Reno, Nevada, which is one racist city, let me tell you. And we we train the canvassers, who are rank and file hotel and casino workers who take a leave of absence and spend 3 months in a, extended stay motel, going door to door 6 days a week. And we train them in how to have a real conversation at the door in a brief period of time. And it very often it begins by demonstrating your own personal vulnerability in the context of explaining why it's so important to you, this particular election, what it means in your own life, and that by telling a personal story. And that story, and this is sort of a version of what Marshall Gans has been working on for many years, but public narrative, but it's very particular. And you create this micro relationship, which can, and I have seen it happen in amazing, astounding ways, enable someone who has no desire to talk to you at all start telling you some of the most important things in their own lives. And I think it's not what I like about Unite Here's approach is that they have taken that individual interaction and found a way to actually scale it up, to make it happen on a large scale with real targets on a daily basis to the extent that it actually makes a difference. I think that this is one tactic that can help the genuine one-to-one conversation, which involves at least as much listening as talking. And but it's not easy. I make it sound easy. It is not easy, especially when people come to the door with their gun on their hip, because Nevada is an open carry state.
Thank you both for that. I'm going to put some resources in the chat about Marshall Gans also, because I appreciate that addition. We are, out of audience questions, so I'm going to pivot back to mine. But if people have additional questions to come through, by all means, this is not a closure; it is just a pause. And I want to get to something that is really important for us to talk about, and is maybe a slight pivot, which is to Michelle to talk about some of your more current research. And in particular, we've been having this conversation about sort of the porous and intersecting nature of borders internationally, but you do work thinking about borders within the U.S. and dual sovereignty issues here within indigenous communities also, right? And in particular, have been studying post-McGirt versus Oklahoma, which was a U.S. Supreme Court case in 2020, which affirmed that nearly half of Oklahoma is tribal territory, right? And also, we know that Oklahoma has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world, 4th highest in the US and one of the highest in the world, right? Thinking about those kind of overlapping foundations and now doing this research about these jurisdictional fights about borders. I wonder if you could give us some insight into what that work is looking like.
I don't know about insight, but I can share with you what I'm doing and what I'm thinking about. I think that McGirt is a case that's really important in terms of like Indian law and is viewed as a landmark case. I mean, it is no small thing to say half of Oklahoma belongs to the 5 civilized tribes. So, but it's also not all the land that belonged to them, right? So I think in the land back moment, and when we're thinking about borders, it's really important to connect the interior with the kinds of borders that are, I think, moving through our cities and like we live in a world of checkpoints, and we live in a world of potential spaces for the border to appear, and we should take all that quite seriously. But I also think it is absolutely essential in understanding the U.S. settler carceral state and where it is historically now, that we have to understand historically the kinds of violations that occurred, violence, and the fact that we're talking about stolen land to begin with. So there's a lot here that's important in that. But McGirt is interesting because this is this amazing ruling that somehow gives back half of Oklahoma, but in the process creates, I mean, it's heralded by tribal actors and myself included as, an incredible win for arguably the rule of law, right? So this is a space where we would think about it and not the rule of the strong, not the rule of kind of the paramilitary forces we're talking about. But I do have a question about how and what kind of sovereignty is achieved around these sorts of things if it's given and enacted on settler carceral terms. And so part of what we've seen in the aftermath of McGirt is that in order to participate in this, to gain jurisdiction, all the tribes have had to expand their carceral apparatus. So more police, more hiring of prosecutors, more judges, because the first question was, how is Tulsa and half of Oklahoma going to be safe if it's handed over to the tribes? And so there was from the beginning kind of this ultimatum that in order to test sovereignty and autonomy, the tribes were going to have to do it on carceral terms. And so I think that, the other side of that is a very important one, which Cherokee Nation, which I'm a citizen of, and other places were also trying to probably carve out spaces within that to move in non-punitive directions, right? To find ways to provide wraparound support, to deal with issues perhaps differently. But the dominant tone of this has been entirely a discussion about more police, more jails, more complexes to do this kind of work. And I think that's a harbinger. I mean, it continues to be a space that tells us about where we are and what it takes to gain autonomy under these terms. So another way I think to think about it is, around this idea of cross-deputization, which is in order to make all of this work, tribes historically have had to, from the beginning when police entered Indian country, maintain these cross-deputizations with U.S. Marshals and the FBI and all these other spaces, right, under federal law, but also municipal and state level government with Oklahoma and other spaces. So we can see this with ICE as well, right? This is all built around this network of cross-deputizations where we extend out by deputization policing infrastructure in the United States. And thinking about what police is, I think Ruth Gilmore Wilson, really said it best when we think about George Floyd. Like, you had a convenience clerk who was basically occupationally deputized to make a call, as we all are with 911 calls, and then out of this comes this kind of force and violence. So I think, it's a case that's bound up with Indian country, but for me, it tells us about the foundations of where we come from. It tells us about options otherwise that could be there in place. And I think it tells us at the border what we're up against when we try and think about sovereignty. So thank you for letting me talk a minute about McGirt.
No, thank you for talking about it. And I think, the other lesson in that too is, right, the creation of borders requires, at least in our cultural and legal framework, the creation of someone to enforce those borders, right? And so as the border continues moving inward, right, we talked in our last session about the comments about Lake Michigan being a border with Canada. And so Chicago is on the border, right, or the potential, I mean, in the immigration context, right, every airport is a border. Yeah. And so every place is a border then. If there's an airport every few miles, right? Or every 100 miles or something, right? So that conception of then as the border sort of creeps into our consciousness, it also is creeping into our communities, and that brings with it a whole set of sequelae, right? As your work shows, Michelle, and sort of imperatives to do certain kinds of enforcement activities. And I think, one of the things that you touched on, and maybe we can end on a moment of hope together, right, is the way that there still are communities, though, who are working towards building infrastructure of care and building out ways to, scale is maybe not the right word, but to sort of build out more resources for existing Indigenous processes of community safety and community care and mutual aid and things that produce safety upstream. And I know there was a comment in the chat also about shifting from a public safety to a public health framework, right? I think that conception. So I wonder if we could spend our last couple of minutes together sort of reflecting on those ideas, right? And we've had, this has been a theme of our conversation so far too, but sort of what it takes to build out forms of governance that are not rooted in sort of a punitive control, but instead in a different sensibility around accountability to each other and safety that we produce together.
So you mentioned earlier that Rachel Hertzing was on the call. I don't know if she's still with us, but the work that she did while she was still in Oakland Oakland, California, across the bay from San Francisco, is emblematic of that kind of community building. You start out by trying to understand from the point of view of the community, what are the things that people are afraid of? What are the things that make them not be safe? And then you figure out ways that you can deal with those things, with those genuine fears people have, without having to call the police. And so you start with an understanding of what safety would look like and security would look like. And then, so just to use one example, one of the things they did was some work on training in first aid and ways of dealing with medical emergencies that would not require calling 911. Because if in Oakland you call 911, you don't just get an ambulance, you will get the police. And once you have the police, you have the danger that somebody's going to be shot. And so this work within communities is, I think, a valuable way of building a different approach. It's small, it's tiny. It didn't even change Oakland, really, but it's a model, and we have to start somewhere.
I would just add, I echo all of that to the T, Rebecca. And I would say, these practices are everywhere. These kinds of efforts at the community level. I mean, I'm in Appalachia. I work in rural and urban areas. People are working on harm reduction. People are working on alternative crisis response. People are stopping the largest and most expensive federal prison in U.S. history that's been trying to come into Letcher County in Kentucky. Like, there's amazing work happening. We don't hear about it often, and I think that's another question related to media. So how do we hear about these things? How do we become acquainted? How do we find a sense of belonging in these spaces? But also scale. We can think about scale, and I come from and am returning to traditions where there was a time before police and prisons, and everything was handled differently for thousands of years.
Right.
I so appreciate you both for making the time to be with us. Thank you so much. We are indebted to you for that. I'm going to drop one more link in the chat, which is an article in Yes Magazine about the Indigenous reclamation of that land from the federal prison. And there are some folks here also at the Institute to End Mass Incarceration at the law school who are involved in representing those folks in that land deal. So movement lawyers, I know, has come up, but we're grateful for the people doing that work, but we're also especially grateful to the organized leader in that charge. And thank you all. We're back October 29th. We really appreciate you. And I did drop a link in the chat to a prior talk from 2 years ago with Rachel, who graced us with her presence here. So thank you all for connecting that continuity. Appreciate you so much.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. Michelle, it was so great to meet you.
Yeah, I want to meet again. Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you,
Take
Katie.
care. Really appreciate you. Bye-bye.
Bye.